And now, a next-level moment from AT&T Business. Say you've sent out a gigantic shipment of pillows, and they need to be there in time for International Sleep Day. You've got AT&T 5G, so you're fully confident. But the vendor isn't responding, and International Sleep Day is tomorrow. Luckily, AT&T 5G lets you deal with any issues with ease, so the pillows will get delivered and everyone can sleep soundly, especially you. AT&T 5G requires a compatible plan and device. Coverage not available everywhere. Learn more at att.com/5G network.
The mother of all sales is happening right now at Designer Shoe Warehouse. Score up to 25% off big deal brands like Adidas, Crocs, Converse, Reebok, and more. And just in time for Mother's Day. Find the perfect gift for her or for you, because Mama needs a new pair of shoes. And hurry, this mother-loving deal ends Sunday. Save up to 25% at your DSW store or DSW.com today.
This is Paige, the co-host of Giggly Squad. I use Uber Eats for everything, and I feel like people forget that you can truly order anything, especially living in New York City. It's why I love it. You can get Chinese food at any time of night, but it's not just for food. I order from CVS all the time. I'm always ordering from the grocery store. If a friend stops over, I have to order champagne. I also have this thing that whenever I travel, if I'm ever in a hotel room, I never feel like I'm missing something because I'll just Uber Eats it. The amount of times I've had to Uber Eats hair items like hairspray, deodorant, you name it, I've ordered it on Uber Eats. You can get grocery, alcohol, everyday essentials in addition to restaurants and food you love. So in other words, get almost anything with Uber Eats. Order now. For alcohol, you must be legal drinking age. Please enjoy responsibly. Product availability varies by region. See app for details.
I'm Christy Schreiber, and we're here to discuss books that have changed the world and have changed us.
And I'm Gary Schreiber, and this is the How to Love Lit podcast. Last episode, we began our discussion of Oscar Wilde by discussing the events surrounding Wilde's most resounding success, the importance of being earnest, and the aftermath, which ultimately changed the course of his life, which was his arrest and his imprisonment. We also highlighted a few comments made in his extraordinary confessional letter written in prison, De Profundis, the complete text for which was not even made public until 1962. As we continue to discuss the play itself, I want to begin by revisiting Wilde's confessional letter to Douglas, not necessarily as a lens through which to interpret Wilde's play, necessarily as much as to allow it to raise a few questions about Wilde's play that it most certainly asks. I want to point out that even though De Profundis is a confessional of sorts, not one time does Wilde claim that his sexual orientation was the cause of his suffering. It's an interesting distinction, and given the time period, that seems unusual. He is not apologizing for the crime that caused his demise. The crime, as described by the government, is not his error. What Wilde claims to be his sin, to use a biblical word, although I'm not sure it's the right one, is the worship of indolence and triviality. That is what, as he looks at his life, that was where he derailed. The problem was a cult of idleness whose purpose is quite literally mindlessness. He claims, and I quote, "The supreme vice is shallowness," which, of course, feels very ironic in light of his final play, which makes the claim that in matters of grave importance, style, not sincerity, is the vital thing.
Correct. And I think his perspective in retrospect just heightens the thematic importance of the play. Of course, some people don't consider the importance of being earnest a piece of satire. Satire, as you recall, by definition, criticizes something in society that the artist thinks is wrong. Wilde most certainly is talking about idleness and triviality in this play, but is he satirizing it or is he admiring it? In some ways, the play honors the lifestyle of these men, which in those days they called dandies. Of course, we're not going to answer that question, and you don't really have to answer the question to like the play, but it's certainly something to think about. And whether you consider this work a piece of satire or not, there's no one that doubts the literary strategies on which the entire play centers: farce, paradox, irony, and most famously, the epigram. Wilde is the king of the epigram, and everyone admires him for those. Very few after him have mastered the epigram in the way that he did.
So let's start there. Let's define what a dandy is as well as an epigram.
Okay, I'll start with epigram. An epigram is a short, memorable saying that expresses a witty or insightful thought. So a lot of them are satirical. A lot of his are satirical. Nowadays, when we're talking about epigrams, we mostly just say, I know a quote. We might say, I heard a quote the other day. And what we mean is, I heard an epigram the other day. I heard something that was witty and I thought it was true about life. When we left off our discussion last episode, we left Algernon, otherwise known as Algie, and Jack, and they were bantering back and forth. And basically all they were doing is spitting out one funny epigram after the other. A few of them have gotten quite famous over the years, by the way. For example, one of the things that Wilde makes fun of in this play multiple times all the way through is the institution of marriage. And as Jack and Algernon are talking, Jack confesses to Algernon that he wants to propose to Algernon's cousin Gwendolen. Algernon presents the idea of marriage as distasteful. He claims, and let me quote him, "The very essence of romance is uncertainty. If I get married, I'll certainly try to forget that fact." Meaning he'll try to forget the fact that he's married. Further on, he turns completely on the traditional concept of marriage, and because we think of marriage as being a holy institution made in heaven. And he says this, let me quote him, "Divorces are made in heaven."
Well, I can only imagine that the crowd roared in applause at that line.
Well, exactly. And this was Wilde's great skill. He would take a commonly held idea, like marriage is made in heaven, and he completely flips it. He does this again a little while later when Algernon is complaining about, quote, "Girls never marry the men they flirt with. Girls don't think it's right." I mean, this play is just full of one topsy-turvy line after another, and it displaces conventional wisdom or accepted tropes by observing that perhaps it's not the trope that's true. It's the opposite of the trope that's true.
And Algernon isn't the only character who gets to deliver the one-liners. When Algernon confronts Jack of going by the name of Earnest in the city and Jack in the country, Jack defends himself by saying that he's a guardian to a young girl and, as such, has a duty to have a high moral tone. He then says this, "A high moral tone can hardly be said to conduce very much to one's health or one's happiness, and that is the whole truth, pure and simple."
To which Algie famously responds, "The truth is rarely pure and never simple. Modern life would be very tedious if it were either, and modern literature a complete impossibility."
So what we see Wilde develop are characters that no one in their right mind would take seriously, except the irony is the characters themselves take themselves seriously.
Exactly.
They take everything seriously, from the cucumber sandwiches to finding a baby in a handbag, and nothing is funny to them, which makes it all funny to us. You know, Wilde's basic comedic formula is simply to say things Victorian society believe about their society, but really don't have the nerve to say out loud.
And sometimes we don't either, and it's funny. I mean, anyone who has ever been in a loveless marriage, perhaps many in the audience, would absolutely agree that divorce was made in heaven, but would never say such a thing out loud. And of course, he pokes fun at marriage because comedies are almost always about love and marriage. But in this play, you'll notice there's not real love. I mean, it's just the hypocrisy of matchmaking that Wilde reveals from start to finish. But the epigrams, that's just the beginning of Wilde's mischief making. I mean, he takes two gentlemen from society in those days that they called dandies, and he tells us what they are really thinking. Then he introduces us to these very prim and proper women that they're courting, and he shows how the courting dynamic really works. Except in this story, it all works out in the end, despite of everyone's duplicity. Gary, let's start with dandies. We've used that word twice, and we haven't defined it yet. What's a dandy?
Well, we'll go with the current time period from which the book comes. But the dandy, if we're going to find a modern word for it, would be your metrosexual male. They were very fashionable, paying particular attention to always being well dressed. They were gentlemen who enjoyed nice things, rich, of course, but they enjoyed parties. Often they did not work very hard, or at least that was the cliche. I mean, let's look at these two guys, and neither one of them seemed very serious about a profession. Oscar Wilde himself is an excellent example of a dandy. To this day, when you read about him, authors almost always mention the way he dressed. But Algernon and Jack, as constructed characters in the image of Wilde, are definitely stereotypical dandies. I mean, they're interested in partying. They're interested in getting out of family obligations. They're interested in refined champagne and good food. And they're just interested all in excess.
Yes. And in order to make their best lives work, both Jack and Algernon have constructed highly sophisticated techniques to create different images of themselves for the different audiences that they're appealing to. Now, this concept of someone's performing self being different, but yet also being the same as one's authentic self, that's kind of a sophisticated and somewhat disturbing idea. But Wilde, in order to not disturb the deep psychology of his intended viewers, introduces this whole dynamic of presenting self and authentic self and both sides being one and the same, using a playful neologism.
Well, what I find fascinating about this is, of course, he's discussing authentic and presenting self before those were even ideas picked up in the field of psychology. So once again, authors were the early psychologists. And anyway, a neologism, let's explain what a neologism is. Neologism, neo means new, logos means word. In other words, Wilde makes up a new word, and the word that he makes up is bunburying.
It's kind of hard to say. Algernon accuses Jack of bunburying, which basically means he's made up a fake person to pretend to go see by the name of Bunbury in order to have a handy excuse when he needs to get out of social obligations he doesn't want to go to. Algernon readily confesses that he's made up a friend, and he's given this friend a name, and the friend's name is Bunbury. And anytime he wants to get out of a social situation, if he wants to avoid dinner with his aunt, he claims he has to go see this invalid, is what he calls him, Bunbury. Of course, that's not a word we say now, but that's what happens. He then goes on to accuse Jack of creating his own Bunbury, which of course Jack has. Jack has made up a fake brother. So he doesn't have a fake invalid friend. He has a fake brother. And he tells his ward, the girl that he has to take care of in the country, that he has to come to town in order to take care of his younger brother, Earnest. But he doesn't have a younger brother, Earnest. He's made up the whole thing. Let's read what Algernon tells Aunt Augusta about Bunbury and watch how this whole facade works.
I'm afraid, Aunt Augusta, I shall have to give up the pleasure of dining with you tonight after all.
Oh, I hope not, Algernon. It would put my table completely out. Your uncle would have to dine upstairs. Fortunately, he's accustomed to that.
It is a great bore, and I need hardly say, a terrible disappointment to me, but the fact is I have just had a telegram to say that my poor friend Bunbury is very ill again. They seem to think I should be with him.
It is very strange. This Bunbury seems to suffer from curiously bad health.
Yes, poor Bunbury is a dreadful invalid.
Well, I must say, Algernon, that I think it is high time that Mr. Bunbury made up his mind whether he is going to live or die. This shilly-shallying with the question is absurd, nor do I in any way approve of the modern sympathy with invalids. I consider it morbid. Illness of any kind is hardly a thing to be encouraged in others. Health is the primary duty of life. I am always telling that to your poor uncle, but he never seems to take much notice as far as any improvements in his ailments go. I should be much obliged if you would ask Mr. Bunbury from me to be kind enough not to have a relapse on Saturday, for I rely on you to arrange my music for me. It is my last reception, and one wants something that will encourage conversation. particularly at the end of the season when everyone has practically said whatever they had to say, which in most cases was probably not much.
I'll speak to Bunbury and Augusta if he is still conscious, and I think I can promise you he'll be all right by Saturday. Of course, the music is a great difficulty. You see, if one plays good music, people don't listen. And if one plays bad music, people don't talk. But I'll run over the program I've drawn out, and if you will kindly come into the next room for a moment.
The second literary device I want to point out is irony. And irony is just a fancy word that means opposite. So when we say something and the opposite happens to be true, that's called verbal irony. And you can do this on purpose, or sometimes you can do it unintentionally. When characters in a play say something or think something, but the audience understands that the opposite is true, we call that dramatic irony. And of course, when a situation turns out to be the opposite of what we would expect to happen, we call that situational irony. This play really functions on the basis of all three forms of irony. But here we're introduced to dramatic irony. The rest of the play, the audience is in on the secret. Of course, the dramatic irony of this conversation is that the audience knows that there is no such person as Bunbury. No one is ill. He just doesn't want to go to dinner with his aunt.
Correct. But what I think is funny is that the way these lines are spoken, either Aunt Augusta is one of the most callous human beings that ever lived, or she knows he's lying to her and she's letting him off the hook on the condition that he promises to come to this other event she's going to have where she wants him to entertain her guests.
Correct. And I think it's the second, which is why I think Aunt Augusta, or Lady Bracknell, as she's called, it's how Jack is going to call her, she's a great character. She's clearly a strong woman, and she understands how to navigate this world of obvious falseness. I mean, she's not challenging the social norms of her day. She uses the social norms of her day to get what she wants. She wants Algie to play this music for her, so she manipulates that. I also want to point out that her husband, the poor guy who's married to Lady Bracknell, is never on stage. And in this case, we see that he apparently has his own set of illnesses to get out of his own social obligations with his wife. So in other words, he likely has his own version of a Bunbury. Everyone in this play is playing a game, and the audience is in on it.
And as an audience member caught up in this same kind of problem, in this same kind of world of social obligation, of course it's funny, they get it. Who hasn't made up an excuse like this? I mean, I know I've had many students, not to be callous, but they've killed off their grandmothers over and over again. I almost come to expect that if an exam is coming up that's going to be difficult, somebody's grandmother will most certainly get sick and die on the night before. This is especially common among students who tend to procrastinate. There's a correlation between grandmothers dying and procrastination.
And big exams. I have the same problem. So many dead grandmothers on the final week of exams. And of course, I don't want to sound callous like Lady Bracknell does, but in my profession, we just, play along. And there's many times I would have loved to say something like what she says to some of my students who I know are making this up.
Well, in case you haven't figured it out, we're making a joke. We don't really not care when people's grandmothers die. I mean, we're just saying when students want to get out of tests, they use their grandmothers as Bunburys. I mean, they can't use their mothers because the school would know, but a grandmother is a close enough relative that, no teacher would hold a student accountable for not being ready for a test if their grandmother had really just died or at least was in serious condition in the hospital. But we can spot a Bunbury when we see one.
Yes, everyone can. Bunbury is really the symbol of how low many of us are willing to stoop in order to get out of social obligations. We can laugh because we are all guilty. Pay attention. Even the tutor in Act 2 and the minister have Bunburys in this play. Everyone has a Bunbury.
I know our main thrust in this episode is to highlight a few literary terms like epigram and irony, but I want to introduce a historical term because it certainly plays into Wilde's sense of ironic humor here. So beginning in the 18th century, but certainly here in the 19th century, something that had become very trendy was this thing called a salon. A salon was typically hosted by aristocratic women. You know, the trend started in Paris, but it spread all over Europe, and it even crossed the Atlantic to the Americas. But the idea was every week women held weekly gatherings for invited guests, and these got to be very culturally important. At salons, men and women would talk about art and literature and philosophy and science, you know, that sort of thing. And they would showcase music like what Algernon is doing here. Writers would be invited to read their works. At a salon, wit was the most important skill to have, and good conversation is how you stood out. Wilde, of course, did well in this environment, but what's really interesting about salons, and it's exactly what we see here, they were places where women held the power, and they had real power. If word got around in salons that a man was worthless, he would not be acceptable in society. And women wielded a lot of influence, and they flexed this power in this setting of the salon. And, you know, notice how insignificant Lord Bracknell is. But also Jack and Algernon are both lesser than their female counterparts in this environment. And Lady Bracknell is the matriarch, and she is the enforcer of form. And form is what is most powerful in the world of the salon. Of course, we will see both female love interests assert their own power in their own way, because in this salon world where form is supreme understanding, how to manipulate words and form is how you get what you want. And what you want, of course, is money.
Money.
Money is what is moving this world. It's always in the subtext of every conversation. It is driving all the decisions.
And Lady Bracknell knows it. She is looking for a good match for her daughter. She's looking to secure her daughter's financial future. And as she interviews Jack, she basically says as much.
Well, yeah. Her interview questions are hilarious.
Oh, they are. And of course, she's made a list of men her daughter is allowed to marry, and it's the exact same list as everyone else. And she explicitly tells Jack that. But then she goes on to say, I'm quite ready to enter your name should your answers be what a real affectionate mother requires. You know, she asks him if he smokes, and he does, and she's glad because she considers that an occupation. In other words, thank goodness he's a gentleman. He doesn't actually work. She asks his age. She asks what he knows, and I love his response. He says this, I know nothing, which of course is the correct response. I mean, let's read a part of this interview. What do you know?
I know nothing, Lady Bracknell.
I am pleased to hear it. I do not approve of anything that tampers with natural ignorance. Ignorance is like a delicate exotic fruit. Touch it and the bloom is gone. The whole theory of modern education is radically unsound. Fortunately, in England at any rate, education produces no effect whatsoever. If it did, it would prove a serious danger to the upper classes and probably lead to acts of violence on Grosvenor Square. What is your income?
Between $7,000 to $8,000 a year.
In lands or in investments?
In investments, chiefly.
That is satisfactory. What between the duties expected of one during one's lifetime and the duties exacted after one's death, land has ceased to be a profit or a pleasure. It gives one position and prevents one from keeping it up. That's all that can be said about land.
I have a country house with some land, of course, attached to it, about 1,500 acres, I believe, but I don't depend on that for my real income. In fact, as far as I can make out, the poachers are the only people who make anything out of it.
A country house? How many bedrooms? Well, that point can be cleared up afterwards. You have a townhouse, I hope. A girl with a simple, unspoiled nature like Gwendolen could hardly be expected to reside in the country.
Well, I own a house in Belgrave Square, but it is let by the year to Lady Bloxham. Of course, I can get it back whenever I like at 6 months' notice.
Lady Bloxham? I don't know her.
Oh, she goes about very little. She is a lady considerably advanced in years.
Well, nowadays, that is no guarantee of character. What number in Belgrave Square?
149.
The unfashionable side. I thought there was something. However, that could easily be altered. You know, this banter, it goes on for a while. And it's funny because Lady Bracknell is revealing the values of the audience. How much money do you have? Where do you live? The problem comes on a little later when she gets around to asking Jack about his family line. And he reveals to her that he doesn't have a family line. What he has is a train line. I mean, it's an absurd admission. And I want to introduce a couple of other terms here because they're comedy techniques, and artists to this day are using these same techniques. This entire conversation, this entire situation about his birth is a farce. And now, a farce, you may have heard that word, but it's when an artist takes a situation and he just blows it out. He makes it completely absurd. In farce, the artist takes a regular scene and it becomes highly exaggerated. It's extravagant, ridiculous, absurd, and it's got to be completely improbable.
You know, I'm reminded of some of America's favorite comedians. They were known for their farces, like Lucille Ball and Don Knotts and Jerry Seinfeld and Steve Carell. If you've ever seen an episode of The Office, it's what makes it funny. I mean, he takes a situation that might happen in an office, then he makes it more exaggerated, more ridiculous, more absurd than you could ever imagine that situation to be. And the whole awkwardness that surrounds it is extremely funny.
Exactly. And that is what is going on here. Jack reveals to Lady Bracknell that he is a foundling, you know, the way that Moses is a foundling in the Bible, or Romulus and Remus are the foundlings when they founded Rome. I mean, this is one of those jokes that the more educated you are, the funnier something is. And you have to remember, Oscar Wilde, besides being brilliant, is extremely well educated. I mean, his work at Oxford was exceptional. He's well versed in the classics and of all kinds. So this is the joke for the well-read person. Everyone who's read the Bible or classical texts knows that foundlings are almost always heroes. I mean, think Oedipus Rex. But Jack is no hero. It's just another element of the farce. In Jack's case, he was found in a handbag in a railway station. That is not divine birth. That is negligence. But he goes on to describe it as if it were an event of divinity because he completes it with all the details. He has the handbag to this day, like you might keep a relic. The handbag, he says, has handles. It was in the cloakroom at Victoria Station. He was found at the station on Brighton Line. He was named after the destination on the first-class ticket that was in the pocket of the man who was given the handbag by mistake with the baby in it for his own. The town that he was going to was named Worthing, hence his name. Oh, and Worthing, the town, is a seaside resort in Sussex. I mean, all these details, they're precise, just in the same way people are precise about their own importance if they have famous lineage. Maybe if they have, you know, we call that blue blood, or if you have, in the case of Great Britain, royal lineage. But this is absurd. Of course, we'll talk more about parody and lampooning works of art in the final episode, but this is just the beginning of all that. Finally, Lady Bracknell calls it all off, and she says, "The line is immaterial. To be born, or at any rate bred, in a handbag, whether it has handles or not, seems to me to display contempt for the ordinary decencies of family life that reminds one of the worst excesses of the French Revolution. And I presume you know what that unfortunate movement led to." I mean, this is funny. She finally concludes that being from a handbag, in her words, quote, could hardly be regarded as an assured basis for a recognized position in good society. Then she tells him he needs to find relatives before the end of the season. Now, the season, that doesn't mean like from fall to autumn to spring or winter. We're not talking about that kind of season. We're talking about the courting season, that period of time when all the rich people come to London for these season of parties, and basically ladies and gentlemen are on the open market for a spouse.
You know, in other words, I don't care how you handle it.
Right.
But you need to find a good name to go with your money and your house on the right side of town before I find another dandy that's on the market during the husband finding season. How's that for translation?
Yeah, that's how we'd say it here.
There you go. Love has nothing to do with it, but this is a high stakes game, and you better be competitive if you want my daughter. What my daughter thinks she wants or what she thinks she loves has nothing to do with it. Find the cash. Find the bloodline, we'll make a deal.
Exactly. And of course, that's a reductionist way of looking at what the season is all about. But in essence, you could say that that's really what every London mom was doing. I mean, whether they want to say it out loud or not. The fact that Wilde exposes all of this in this exaggerated way is funny. Lady Bracknell says out loud things Victorian English people, or even us today, pretend to ignore, and she just doesn't.
Why am I having visions of Bridgerton in this discussion?
I know, it's very much Bridgerton. That's exactly the basis for Bridgerton.
Yes. Well, she and Gwendolyn leave, and we're left to hear the fallout through the funny epigrams that are going to come out of the dialogue between Algernon and Jack as Jack tries to sort out his situation with his friend.
Well, there are many more epigrams, and many of them reveal paradoxes, which is the last literary term I want to talk about this episode. Now, this is complicated. It's a complicated idea, but it's really where Wilde truly exerts his mastery, his skill as an artist. Now, when we teach in school to students what paradoxes are, we say that a paradox is something that doesn't seem like it could be true on the surface, but when you think about it, it really is true. And that's a simplified way of saying it. If you're going to look it up in the dictionary, it would say something like paradoxes are apparent contradictions. They seem to be statements that are meant to be ironic, but they're not ironic, and that's what's shocking about them. Paradoxes mean exactly what they say, but they appear to be the opposite of the way things really are. When you catch the paradox, you understand that what the author is saying is a truth or an insight that's deeper, that's challenging what we think should be true, but actually isn't. People that explore paradoxes are talking about complicated ideas and they're challenging assumptions. When we understand the paradoxes of this play, we begin to understand the satire, what Wilde is really criticizing about his audience. And that's funny too. If you remember Algernon's speech about Bunbury, he says this: well, one must be serious about something if you want to have any amusement in life, and I happen to be serious about Bunburying. What on earth are you serious about? I haven't got the remotest idea. About everything, I should fancy. You have an absolutely trivial nature. Of course, he's talking to Jack. But these lines appear to be ridiculous. They also kind of appear to be ironic. I mean, how can you be serious about Bunburying? But actually, Wilde does mean exactly what he says. Wilde, as we know from his personal life, practiced this duplicit living. The problem with Victorian society, or really all society, is that convention often fails to reckon with human nature. We can't be honest about what we really think, about who we really are, about what we really believe. So we have to lie. Not because we necessarily want to lie, but because society is false. We have to be serious about Bunburying to be successful at this game we play called society. So here's how Algernon and Jack pretend to be earnest, but aren't, but then at the end actually are. I mean, it's how Wilde wishes the world would work, but it doesn't work authentically.
Okay, so that was a particularly confusing statement you made right there. I want to try to simplify that and say it again. So the difference between a paradox and irony is that you're being ironic. You say one thing, but you mean the opposite. But a paradox is when you say one thing and you mean exactly what you say, but people don't believe you because they think you're being ironic. And you mean the opposite of what you said.
Exactly.
That's still not any clear, okay? It kind of reminds me of when kids play that game rock, paper, scissors, and you try to guess what the other person is going to play, but then you have to guess what they think you're going to play, and then you have to play the opposite of that, so on and so on and so on. A lot of strategery.
It's confusing in exactly that way. I don't know if your explanation made more sense than mine.
Well, the idea is confusing, but the fun of the play is sorting out what Wilde means to be ironic and what Wilde means for us to be taken seriously. And of course, the dramatic irony is easy to spot, but I think in almost all of his dialogue, he means exactly what he says. I mean, look at this conversation between Jack and Algernon. Jack asks Algy if he thinks Gwendolyn will become like her mother, to which Algy responds, "All women become like their mothers. That is their tragedy. No man does. and that's his. I mean, it's a funny line. You have to think about it. I mean, is this true? Is this a tragedy on the part of a woman or the part of a man?
Exactly. And the entire conversation, it really is a mental workout. I mean, it isn't too far down the dialogue where Algie asks Jack if he's going to tell Gwendolyn the truth about him being Ernest in town and Jack in the country, to which Jack responds, "My dear fellow, the truth isn't quite the sort of thing one tells to a nice, sweet, refined girl. What extraordinary ideas you have about the way to behave to a woman."
And of course, here we see how the paradoxes and the ironies work together. I mean, he means exactly what he's saying. The truth is something you should tell a nice girl, but in modern society, you can't tell a nice girl the truth because she won't be willing to hear it. But, that's not really authentic.
And that is Wilde's criticism of Victorian society. And it's his criticism of our world, really. None of us are earnest in the sense that none of us are authentic. We can't be because of this elaborate game we're playing. And in some cases, the stakes are high. If you're in high society, the stakes must be really high. I mean, they can be financial. They're status related. They're success related.
And honestly, it's about survival. Even the women are in on it. I mean, especially the women are in on it. Act 1 ends with Wilde giving Gwendolyn some lines that are hilarious but also paradoxical. And Gwendolyn had been ushered out by her mother and been told that she cannot marry Jack because of his train lineage. And she comes back in to talk to Jack, and Algie pretends to object, and she immediately shuts him down. And listen to what she says.
"Algie, you always adopt a strictly immoral attitude towards life. You're not quite old enough to do that."
I mean, it's an interesting paradox because we think of young people acting immorally and old people caring about morals. But Gwendolyn has reversed this because really the reverse is true. I mean, young people tend to be optimistic. They tend to want to be authentic. And as they go through life, they become jaded. They become corrupted. And, and if we're not careful, we can actually become a more corrupt version of ourselves. And Wilde means exactly what he's saying here, but it feels the very opposite of what should be the case.
Exactly. And Act 1 ends with what we know to be a farcical plot twist. Gwendolyn asks for Jack's address in the country. Algernon listens in, and although Jack doesn't notice, we as the audience notice that Algernon writes the address down on his shirt cuff. This is dramatic irony at work. We, the audience, know that Algernon is going to the country. He tells Lane, the servant, "I won't be back till Monday." We can assume he's going to try to woo Jack's beautiful and unassuming ward without Jack's knowledge, as Jack plans to stay in town. At least that's what he tells Algie through the weekend, pretending to be Ernest. So the first act ends with Jack accusing Algernon of talking nonsense. He says this, "Oh, that's nonsense, Algie. You never talk anything but nonsense." To which Algernon replies,
"Nobody ever does."
Again, a paradox, because that is precisely the point of the entire play. No one is authentic. No one is honest. All of us are pretending to be Ernest. Except in this case, Wilde is daring us to own it.
Well, that is a lot of upside-down logic. I mean, do we mean what we say? Do we not? Should we mean what we say? Should we not? Is it trivial serious? Is the serious trivial? I mean, Wilde certainly can speak in circles. So next episode, we will continue through both Acts 2 and 3 as we continue our discussion about this seriously trivial play about authenticity. How's that? We hope we didn't confuse you too much today, at least no more than Wilde intended, as we discussed this really delightful and playful commentary on not just Victorian England, but on all of humanity. And if you did, please remember to forward an episode to a friend, share it on social media, text it, refer it to your English teacher. Remember, it's when you share that we grow. Thank you for supporting our efforts to make the English language literature more accessible to as many people as possible.
Peace out.
Hi, I'm Raj Punjabi from HuffPost.
And I'm Noah Michelson, also from HuffPost.
And we're the hosts of Am I Doing It Wrong?, a new podcast that explores the all-too-human anxieties we have about trying to get our lives right.
Each week on the podcast, Raj and I pick a new topic that we want to understand better and bring a guest expert on to talk us through how to get it right.
And we're talking like legit, credible experts. Doctors, PhDs, all-around superheroes.
From HuffPost and Acast Studios, check out Am I Doing It Wrong? Wherever you get your podcasts.
Ever wonder what your lashes are destined for? The cards have spoken. Maybelline New York Mascara does it all. Whether you crave fully fan lashes with Lash Sensational, big, bold volume from the Colossal, a dramatic lift with Falsies Lash Lift, or natural-looking volume from Great Lash, your perfect lash future awaits. Manifest your best mascara today. Shop Maybelline New York and discover your lash destiny. Shop now at Walmart.
This is Paige, the co-host of Giggly Squad. I use Uber Eats for everything, and I feel like people forget that you can truly order anything, especially living in New York City. It's why I love it. You can get Chinese food at any time of night, but it's not just for food. I order from CVS all the time. I'm always ordering from the grocery store. If a friend stops over, I have to order champagne. I also have this thing that whenever I travel, if I'm ever in a hotel room, I never feel like I'm missing something because I'll just Uber Eats it. The amount of times I've had to Uber Eats hair items like hairspray, deodorant, you name it, I've ordered it on Uber Eats. You can get grocery, alcohol, everyday essentials in addition to restaurants and food you love. So in other words, get almost anything with Uber Eats. Order now. For alcohol, you must be legal drinking age. Please enjoy responsibly. Product availability varies by region. See app for details.